Well, folks, there's a lot going on with making decisions about how companies are trying to return to work after the pandemic. And there's a lot of concerns for ideas and ways that people can come back together as a team. But today we're going to dive deep into that. My guest is an expert in this field.
You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Hello again, everyone. This is Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I am your host, Doug Thorpe. And as the lead said, we're going to talk about employee engagement and the return to work. And I've got an expert in the field. She is a globally recognized coach. She's part of Marshall Goldsmith's 100 Coaches. She's a Thinker 360 member and highly recognized there. And there's two new announcements that just came out. I'll let her share those. Her name is Morag Barrett, and she's calling from the Colorado area. So Morag, welcome to the show.
Hey, Doug, it's great to be here.
As I was reading your bio, there's a ton of things you've done and been involved in. You were a visionary. You wrote a book about remote work before we ever started this. Hold up that first book.
Oh, yes, the Futureproof Workplace. Yes. So I look at that. It's not coming out.
Yeah.
The Futureproof Workplace with Linda Sharkey, and it was ahead of its time. It's still very pertinent. 6 strategies to accelerate talent development, reshape your culture, and succeed with purpose. And Linda and I were talking about hybrid workplaces, how our attitudes to where and how work gets done needs to shift. And then along comes the pandemic and promptly makes all our predictions come true. I love it.
Yeah, there you go. Nothing like good circumstance there to make that happen. Well, before we get into all those details, tell us a little bit about your journey and how you've come to be the dynamic and powerful coach that you are today.
Well, it's interesting because certainly if I go back to high school, this is not what I was picturing I was going to be. I thought I was going to be an engineer, a very logical, pragmatic thinker, studied applied mathematics and physics, but I also studied economics. And there was a chapter on how banks create money, and I found it fascinating. And so I actually did not go into engineering. I went into finance for 15 years, Doug. So I was working with leaders and companies across industries, all stages of their life cycle, back in England at that time, lending millions of pounds to support their business strategy. And I reveled in it. There is a poetry in numbers that I adore. However, it became apparent to me that success in business isn't just about the numbers and the spreadsheet and the cash flow forecast. You can make your forecast predict anything that you want. However, the true measure of success, certainly in banking, was A, could you afford to pay the bank back? But B, did you hit those numbers? And I came to realize that the missing part of the equation that many leaders and companies certainly at that time overlooked was the human side. How business gets done, who we are as individuals, how we relate within teams. And if you think about all the politics, silos, turf wars that happen within companies that slow down business, undermine the quality of decisions, then you'll understand why. And that was the inspiration for my first book, Cultivate the Power of Winning Relationships, looking to provide a language and framework to get us all on the same team, pulling together to deliver those business results that ultimately make the company, the team, and individual leaders successful. And so that pivot is what brought me into leadership and executive development. One of those roles is as an executive coach for leaders and also as a facilitator working with companies across the world. At last count, more than 15,000 leaders, but 20 countries and on 4 continents. And it's fascinating because invariably it's the human element that makes or breaks careers and reputations. And that is my passion.
That's amazing. And as I listen to your story there, it reminds me so much of my own experience, because I too was a banker in my early days. And one of the quick things I discovered was the impact of how owners were managing their teams and the decisions they were making to perpetuate the growth of their business. I actually wrote a premise about it. I called it the paradox of success, because the very thing that was propelling the business forward in the early stages created mass that the owner founder was not able to manage properly. They weren't able to make the pivot with the growth of the business. Effectively, they weren't growing themselves as leaders. Therefore, the company outgrew them. And without some very strategic decisions, like perhaps bringing in a CEO to run the business, those owner founders just, took the unfortunate dive. And I was perplexed by that, because I was looking at a trajectory that was everything everybody had hoped for. They had come out of the box, been in business several years and making great strides, and all of a sudden, poof, it's gone. And not because of a market shift, not because of a product fail, but because that leader owner was not making the changes they needed to make. So
it's interesting you talk about that paradox of success, because a lot of the leaders I'm working with as an executive coach are struggling with those similar internal battles, letting go of what's made them successful to this point, and then learning and branching out new skills, having the courage to coach and develop and therefore delegate to their direct reports. So I'm helping others, but I've also lived through it too, Doug. As I think about when I started SkyeTeam 15 years ago, it was the Morag show. I was a solopreneur. And so I succeeded or failed by what I thought at the time was my own efforts. But even as a solopreneur, we're dependent on each other and others for success, whether that's referrals, whether that's customers, and so on. But as I grew SkyeTeam, as my team came on board, learning that Morag's way was only one way took courage and vulnerability to let go of those reins. And in fact, You, Me, We, the new book, is an example of that, because I've co-authored it with Eric Spencer and Ruby Vesely, who are my allies, my best friends here at SkyeTeam, to share and elevate our platform, because ultimately we are better together. So if Cultivate came out of my individual thought process, Futureproof was a collaboration with Dr. Linda Sharkey. And the journey continues in that if we want to be better, we're better together, with Eric and Ruby and You, Me, We.
So what do you find, what do you think is the biggest roadblock for that solopreneur founder to come to the realization they need to make that shift? What's the thing holding them back from going there?
So I think a lot of it, I know for myself was, well, it's just quicker and easier to do it myself. It is cheaper for me to do it myself. And that, to me, I recognize was a sunk cost fallacy, in that actually my skills are better off used talking with people like yourself, working with leaders and helping them to accelerate their impact, not necessarily doing the QuickBooks. I need to pay attention to the numbers to make sure that we are profitable, etc. But getting a bookkeeper and helping to do that reconciliation released hours every month that I could invest elsewhere. And being curious, that is one of the things I think as adults, we hate being the beginner and the newbie. So therefore we don't ask for help early enough, but we also aren't curious about, is there a faster, better, different way? We get stuck in our rut, much like you described for those startup founders. And if you think about the technology and the pace of change, the tools and resources available to us to automate some of the things that we've been doing manually are always evolving. But if we're not paying attention to those, how do we know when to adopt them to help us, again, free us up to the things that we can only truly do ourselves? So it's courage and vulnerability and curiosity.
And I agree with all that. And what about the element of pride and ego?
Oh, good grief. Yeah, I mean, that's the foundation of all. And when we realize that, in fact, our ego can trip us up the most. I mean, I think about Eric and Ruby and the informed risks that they have taken, that we have taken together. Our egos actually get stroked because we reinforce each other. We challenge each other to grow. We are competitive with each other, but in a way that brings us all together, versus in the toxic environments, which is what I write about in Cultivate and You, Me, We. That competitive is all about me beating you, my team being better than your team, me hoarding talent and information so that I look good. Well, in that scenario, there is always invariably a winner and a loser, but even the winner is undermined because at some point others are going to say, but I don't want to work with you because you are selfish, egotistical, you're all about yourself. So this comes back to the hashtag better together, the ally mindset and the ally mindset profile, where we're focused outward on how do I help you to be successful? Because I have learned over time that if I can help you to be successful, then at some point it does come back to support me. So hence it's you, me, and we.
You know what you said about that leader that's kind of hoarding and holding it all in, and eventually it comes back around as in, I don't want to work for you. I do see that a lot in the larger corporate environments where there's these fiefdoms of power that get bestowed or created because maybe one guy's line of business is more productive and for a moment more profitable than everything else in the company.
Mm-hmm.
So they get a lot of attention and focus, and it really builds a toxic environment. And all of that going on, I think, has been with us for a number of years. But one pretty dominant opinion about one of the outcomes of the pandemic is that the employee is saying, I don't want to work in that toxic culture anymore. And they're now feeling empowered to come back to the big company and say, either this has to change or I'm out. And they're no longer afraid to do the I'm out part of that statement.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I wrote about this in the Futureproof Workplace, and I remember studying it in history, you know, the employer-employee contract and the implicit that if I come and work hard for you, you'll take care of me with a pension or a retirement fund, etc. Well, of course, that has all gone. And what we're looking for as employees, I've yet to meet an individual who is looking to do an average job, who's just putting in time. Now, sometimes the environment causes it. We all want to be set up for success. We all want to feel like our opinions matter, and we all want to feel like we belong. And so as leaders, no matter whether you're the CEO or you're the first line manager of a team, or you're a leader within your team for your peers, we can all make a contribution to that sense of belonging, to asking for others for help or input or their perspective, that makes people choose to stay versus, as we're hearing right now, the great resignation, the great realignment, whatever you want to talk, however you want to describe it. But as you rightly point out, Doug, the pandemic allowed people some perspective into what makes me feel fulfilled. And if it's not here, then I am more willing to go somewhere else because I can now work from anywhere, for anyone, based anywhere. And that power and flexibility has just shifted the conversation.
I'm so glad to hear you describe all of that. For several years now, going back to the early part of the pandemic and some of the leaders I was working with. And by the way, leadership coaching skyrocketed during the pandemic. If anybody's not paying attention to that, leaders were very perplexed and needed and wanted a lot of help trying to make these decisions they were being faced with. But one of the big premises I've been pushing my leaders to understand is, just as you said, I believe when you make your selection, the people you bring onto your team want to do a good job. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to do an average or poor job. Now, you know, occasionally do you find somebody with a defect in their own moral compass? Yes. And, you know, that's a bad hire. So you need to put that in its own category. But for the masses, in the way your process should work and often does work, those people want to do a good job. Therefore, the challenge comes to the leader of defining what a good job looks like, you know, defining what success is. in
Yes.
explaining the boundaries, the milestones, the yardsticks, the procedures, the tools to get there, and give the continued clarity for the ongoing work.
And too often leaders don't. And it's that misguided of, well, Doug's been doing this for a year or two. He knows how to do that job. If I tell him, he's going to think I don't trust him. But the thing is, especially for somebody new on your team or new in your company, you may have been, this is back to the success paradox. They were no doubt successful in the previous organization, but unless we sit down and explain how those guardrails, the rules of engagement are different here, is it any wonder then when people don't meet expectations? Or how does reporting to Morag as your boss, what can you expect from me? What does being an ally and having your back mean from Morag? And how is that similar or different to Doug, who works in that department or function over there?
Yep.
And so I remember in banking being told, well, it's not personal, it's just business, leave your emotions at the door. And that is the worst advice I've ever been given, because all of business is personal and it all comes down to that emotion and sense of connection, and you build it one conversation at a time. And sometimes as leaders, it can feel like we're stating the obvious, but if we don't make the implicit explicit, that's when the mistakes happen. That's when the misunderstandings happen. And that's when relationships get damaged versus strengthened.
I love it. I love it. Well, Morag, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we're going to dive a little further into this idea of setting that clarity for your team so that they have the understanding and you can develop those stronger and better relationships. We'll be right back.
Business is all about solving complex problems as fast as you can create them. Become the best problem solver by leading others to greatness too. And the first step is going to DougThorpe.com. Doug Thorpe is known globally for coaching entrepreneurs and business leaders, improving their performance and the work output of everyone surrounding them. You can find health, wealth, and happiness by learning to lead others to health, wealth, and happiness. Go to DougThorpe.com now and order Doug's books or hire him to coach your managers. That's DougThorpe.com.
Well, greetings, everyone. We're back, and I am talking with Morag Barrett. She is a leadership coach and advisor and runs her own team out of Colorado. It's called SkyeTeam. We'll have all this contact info later. But we were talking before the break about this idea of your regular, if I can use that word, employee is going to show up wanting to do a good job. So the challenge as a leader is to give them the clarity, focus, and direction to help them understand that. And symptomatically, what I find leaders telling me is that they sense that their part of the organization has gotten stuck. And I call it a frozen middle, because what happens is, and this is particularly true in the middle management of a company, using the same premise that good employees want to do good work. Same is true with your middle managers. They want to do a good job for what they're doing, but if you're a senior executive and you're not providing the right clarity, those middle managers don't do the wrong thing, but they freeze because they're afraid of doing the wrong thing. They are not clear what the right thing is, so they just don't do anything. And so if you're a leader and you feel like your organization is somehow stuck, I challenge you with the idea that it may be your message that has broken down, and ultimately your relationship with your people. And that's where you really come in, Morag. You've got a lot of work in this whole relationship side of leadership. So let's start with just kind of framing that up real quick. What is the significance of leaders being able to build relationships?
Well, you can't be successful in business or in life unless you can cultivate winning relationships. Life is a team sport. Work is a team sport. And so in my first book, Cultivate the Power of Winning Relationships, I got tired in my banking career of the finger pointing and blame, because it's easy to be a great colleague when things are going well. The true test is when our project is about to derail, when a pandemic throws everybody for a loop. What happens in those situations? And I saw far too much finger pointing and blame and abdication of responsibility in those times of uncertainty. So I introduced the relationship ecosystem, a way of diagnosing the health of relationships one-on-one or between teams, anything from the ally, the person who is unconditional, has your back, gives you the kick in the pants when you need it, the feedback you need to hear, not necessarily the feedback you always want to hear, through supporters who are like fair weather friends, great to work with, fun to be around until the going gets tough, and then it's like crickets. Right. And then on the dark side, we have rivals, Jekyll and Hyde. When it suits them, they're all for you. Go, Doug, you're the best thing ever. And when it doesn't, they're against you. And of course, you get blindsided, surprised, and caught unawares with those relationships. And then there are the adversaries, the all-out brilliant jerks at best and at worst jerks, who are just continually tough to work with. But going back to our earlier conversation, I've yet to meet anybody who gets up in the morning thinking, I want to be seen as an adversary. I want to make Doug's day a miserable one. And invariably, it's back to what we talked about in the first section. We haven't aligned expectations either on priorities of what we need to do together or the how we're going to work together. So that's the relationship ecosystem. And people listening to this episode can no doubt immediately think about their go-to colleagues, the allies and supporters, and their go-from colleagues, the rivals and adversaries. But what we found at SkyeTeam is we kept getting asked, yes, this is great, but how do I show up as an ally? How do I show up as a best friend at work, as Gallup call it in their Gallup 12 questions for engagement? And so that was the genesis for You, Me, We. And defining from our research and more than 500 leaders who've completed the Ally Mindset Profile, what are the 5 practices that make those truly memorable, exceptional, I jump at the chance to work with you again leaders, versus the ones where you just breathe a sigh of relief when they leave the room? So that's the pinwheel that those who are watching the video can see next to the book, You, Me, We.
That's just an incredibly insightful premise, and I love your definitions of the different actors that show up. And you know, for those of us in coaching that do some work in the personality assessment, one big part of that is not just understanding how you're wired, but trying to build an appreciation for how your wiring is projected and shows up in the moment.
Yes.
And the impact that it has on those around you and the perceptions others, you know, create.
So you're right, with the Ally Mindset Profile, and in fact, for all of your listeners, we've got a unique opportunity for people to take that profile with our compliments. And they can do that by going to SkyeTeam, SKYE, team.cloud/common sense. And when you do it, you'll get your own personal report that shows your insights as to how you show up around the 5 practices of being an ally. And even though I've written 2 books on this topic, and even though my team and I live this every day, we're not perfect, and that's not the goal. We are human. But there are, of those 5 practices, some that come more naturally, certainly to me, and others that I find more challenging. So for example, the foundation is abundance and generosity. Do I care about others' success as much as I do my own? And that is an easy yes for me. For your listeners, connect with me on LinkedIn. If you send me a question, if I can help, I promise it's me that's answering. Now, where I'm not so good on abundance and generosity is making sure that I also meet my own needs, saying no or no, not yet. I'm learning to do that this year. I have 3 Post-it notes on my microphone arm that are my 3 priorities that I should be saying yes to, and everything else I should be saying no to. I'm doing okay on that. But the second piece goes to what you were just saying there, Doug, about how do we meet? That's why the book's called You, Me, We. It starts with me and abundance and generosity and what's my definition of success. And I'm starting to be curious about you and can I help you to be successful? But the second practice is connection and compassion. Because if I don't connect with you at a human level, if I am not curious about your journey to date and where you're hoping to go to and what what fills your bucket and what drains your bucket, you're not going to get to the other three practices. You're not going to get to candor and debate. You're not going to get to action and accountability. So it's a two-way street, but it has to start with me. And that's the premise of you, me, we. In the research that Gallup has been doing around engagement, they've been asking, do I have a best friend at work? And to me, that's the wrong question. It's passive. It allows me to say no because Doug got the promotion or Doug got the shiny project. The question should be, am I a friend at work? Am I celebrating your success as much as my own? And therefore empowering me to go first, because if I am an ally, I will have an ally. If I create a team where we have each other's backs, then risk is reduced. We will take informed risk to move and innovate and move the team forward versus holding back for fear of getting into trouble or making a mistake that undermines the team. And that's the power of being and having allies.
I like the word ally because the word friend is so tricky in the business environment. And so many people have gotten themselves in trouble by fostering real, what you might call traditional friendships at work. And then the moment comes when a tough decision has to be made, and all of a sudden the person they've counted as a friend is on the short list of not getting the shiny project or not getting the award. And that leader has to make the tough decision of saying, I'm not giving it to my friend. And so that whole dynamic of what is a friend at work is so massively slippery in my mind, up to and including everything we saw and heard and talked about in the Me Too movement. I mean,
Yeah.
the personal familiarity went way out of bounds, and those boundaries needed to get reset.
Well, I think that's the difference, is that we didn't articulate them. In fact, the subtitle for you, me, we is why we all need a friend at work and how to show up as one. So if I'm your boss, I can still be friends with you. I can enjoy, because, hey, we spend most of our working lives at work, whether it's behind a camera or back in a three-dimensional office. I'd better like and look forward to hanging out with the people I'm collaborating with. But if we are at the beginning of our relationship, if we're revisiting and recalibrating as we go through, that, Doug, there is going to come a point where I have to give you some tough feedback. How can I best do that? Or, Doug, as a team leader, at some point I may have to make trade-offs, and it may be Sally that's going to get that opportunity and not you. If we've articulated those expectations, then when we have to do that, then we can say, well, Doug, you'll recall, I let you know this is part of my responsibility as a leader for the business and for the team. And here's why. And so long as we've had that ongoing feedback and dialogue, you're not going to be blindsided. You're not going to be resentful. You're going to understand why not now, and understand how you can fill the skills gap, the knowledge gap, or whatever to move forward. Or maybe recognize your career has peaked in this organization and now is the time to go somewhere else. But at least you leave with a story that says, oh yeah, go work for Morag. Look how she's accelerated my career. But as ever, I got to the top, there was nowhere else to go, so I left. Versus, oh God, don't work with Morag. She doesn't care about anybody. That's a whole different story. And I'd rather have the former than the latter.
Absolutely. And when I get into this realm with my clients, I talk about the notion that it's okay as a leader to be friendly at work, but you don't necessarily have to be friends. And I say that more in the what might be considered the secular sense of, let's go get a beer every afternoon when we have a chance to, that kind of thing. And again, even as a leader, there's nothing wrong with that and having some social interaction with your team. But I like the idea that it's really ultimately about setting those boundaries and expectations and understanding, And clarity. It comes back down to clarity. Clarify my role as your leader or your role as my leader, having those very open and candid discussions. And that's still hard for a lot of people that have risen up into various leadership positions to
Oh, it is.
understand.
Well, that's why they need coaches like you and I. That's why leadership development programs are so important, because they help to build the connection as you go through it with a cohort of other leaders in your company, but that common language and framework around how we do business in this organization. And that can help ensure that there's transparency, that there is feedback culture, that there is learning and growth, that there is innovation, but ultimately there's accountability. Because if I drop the ball, then let's stop and learn from it. If I keep dropping the ball, a whole different conversation, then maybe it's time to manage me out. But if I drop the ball, learn from it, and don't do that again, then we've both benefited from that opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. Such an important distinction there. You know, Morag, you've mentioned a couple of times one of my favorite phrases, challenging leaders, how do you show up? So talk a little bit more about that vision in your mind. How does a leader need to show up for their organization?
So in You, Me, We use look up, show up, step up. And so look up is, well, what's your definition of leadership? What makes for a great leader? If you Google the word leadership, you're going to get billions of results on the interwebs, not very useful. So for me, there is only one definition that matters, and that's our own personal definition. Because if you can't define it, how do you know if you're living up to it or missing the goal? So how do you do that? Well, think about the leaders you would jump at the chance to work with again, what made them special, and then adapt and emulate it. Another simple tactic is, what 3 words would you hope others use to describe you at your best? And what 3 words might they use to describe you at your worst? And then ask people and see if there's a correlation. Because if there isn't, then you can be intentional about how you show up. And in each conversation for each person, you can turn the dial up or down. You might say, well, Doug is very experienced on this team. He's got this. I can be more quiet, reflective. I can challenge him to go run. I don't have to tell him what to do. But for somebody who's fresh out of university, as I think about my sons, they may need a little bit more hand-holding, a little bit more guidance. There I might turn up and be intentional about being more assertive, more directional, maybe only do the first few steps, see how they get on, and then add the next few steps of the process. So that's the second step. And then the third piece is all about reflection. It's the step up and did I do it? Because we all know what we should do. And this is what I love about your podcast. It's leadership by common sense. We know what we should do, but that common sense goes out of the window, especially in times of crisis or uncertainty. That's when we start to excuse our poor behavior of, oh, I'm sorry I didn't call you, Doug. I didn't have time. The fire was burning. Or I'm sorry we left you out of that meeting invite. Well, you know, that's just poor leadership. And so the third element of step up is, did I do what I said I was going to do and do it consistently? Did I ultimately do my best? And you do that by asking for feedback, those 3 words that I talked about earlier, and just continually recalibrating. And tomorrow is a whole new leadership day.
It is so important that leaders build in a discipline of some kind of frequent reflection, and perhaps even daily. I've talked to a lot of leadership mentors that I admire, and one of the common threads that comes up is that they profess to have a daily check-in with themselves. And it doesn't take a long process. It's, you might be sitting in the evening after dinner or something, and before you get online or do something otherwise, spend an intentional minute saying, how did today go?
Yes.
What were my moments when I needed to show up? How did I show up? And what could I have done differently? And it is so vital to give yourself that feedback loop, and, be as critical as you want. And of course, there are personalities that I caution, don't be overly critical. I mean, but you need to have some intentionality about asking that question, how did I do? And take from that the opportunity. And as you said, once we turn midnight, today is gone. It's now history, and you have a new day and a new opportunity. And perhaps you spend a minute in the morning before everything unfolds, anticipating what's on your calendar and saying, okay, well, these are the people that are going to be coming to this meeting. How do I need to show up for that?
Yes.
And to your point, flex your leadership skill set for the moment and how it might fit more appropriately.
And to your point, it doesn't require extra work. It's just doing what we're already doing, just a little smarter and more deliberately. And in our current world, where we're going from one Zoom meeting to another, and in the olden days before COVID, where we were rushing from one meeting to another, we often did it mindlessly on autopilot. And so for those listening, if you just take 30 seconds to think about and take a breath, what do I need to achieve in this next conversation? What are the other people looking for from me? And then be thoughtful about how you show up to meet that need, you are going to elevate your leadership reputation and impact in a heartbeat. And it didn't take any time. It didn't take going to a 4-year class. It just required you to be present and thoughtful in the moment.
Well, I know we're getting close to our time here today, Morag, but there's one more question that we covered in the green room that I want to try to get into. And if it's going to take too long, we'll deal with it as another session. But the idea in the Zoom world, we've got virtual workers everywhere, and we're trying to build those relationships through a virtual medium. What are some of the things you advise leaders to think about doing while they're online and trying to create those relationships that we're talking about?
So yes, Zoom has resulted in a very hub and spoke environment because it's one after another. It is hard to build that sense of engagement unless we're thoughtful and deliberate. And so if you're in the habit of getting onto a Zoom call and getting straight down to business, Doug, where are you on that project? What happened in that meeting? Then you're missing an opportunity. And certainly at SkyeTeam and with our clients, we'll spend the first 2 or 3 minutes doing what we call ripples and joys. Think of it as small talk, chit chat, the small talk that gets to the big results. And ripples and joys are what's happened, where have we moved the project forward, successes and wins since we last got together, and joys, anything personal or professional that's made us laugh or smile. And that has brought the human element together. Because ultimately, and I talk about 4 yeses in Cultivate, we want to know that other people care about us as human beings, not just a job title, not just as a pair of hands. And if you're only ever ringing and asking what I'm doing, then I'm going to assume you don't care. But if you pause long enough to ask, how are you doing? That makes a difference and puts a donation, a credit into the relationship bank account. So slow down, make the connection through the camera. It may feel awkward to start with, but I guarantee it will transform that sense of belonging, and it will transform your team sense of togetherness and willingness to overcome future challenges.
Yeah. I've made a statement to many that have been my clients and otherwise, and even here on this podcast. I firmly believe that in a few years, when all the business schools start creating their case studies on the aspects of the pandemic, leadership and otherwise, talking about companies that performed well and companies that didn't during the pandemic, I predict the number one contributing factor to success is going to be the style and effectiveness of communication.
Yes.
And the way leaders have shown up on their Zoom calls or on their Teams calls or whatever technology you're using, it's the way you show up and maintain, sustain, and grow those relationships with your team, with your clients, with your stakeholders. It is a premium to become a better communicator during this environment we've got to be in. And the things you can interject into it, as you described, the ripples and joys, I love that. That's a good way to put it. But maintaining that personable aspect of it, that it's not all business. You don't have to jump immediately into the project plan or the report out, and you might have a 90-page slide deck you think you're going to do in 30 minutes, which, by the way, is insane. I always challenge
Yes.
people when I hear that. Do the math on that. How
Yeah,
much
no.
time are you going to have for each deck?
Yeah.
So that's another whole topic as well. But no, I think it is important that we all consider the way we do show up. And it goes back to what we just said a moment ago. Anticipate a little bit what you're up against, what you're getting ready to walk into, and think intentionally about how you would like to show up so that the audience that's on the call with you, team or otherwise, gets your best self there in the moment, and forget all the other stuff, tune them out, focus on the group you've got in front of you, and go that way. I love it. Well, Morag, this has been great. We do need to wrap it up, and although I would love to keep going here, but I know we can't. So, again, tell everybody the best way to get a hold of you.
Well, I have 3 asks. Please be my ally and pre-order You, Me, We, Why We All Need a Friend at Work and How to Show Up as One from your favorite bookstore. Secondly, take the ally mindset profile and have some insights on how you're showing up. And that was at skyeteam.cloud/common sense. And then connect with me on LinkedIn or check me out at SkyeTeam, SKYE team.com, and learn more about the books, the work that we do, and how we might be able to help you accelerate your success. Thank you, Doug.
That's great, Morag, and thank you so much. And folks, we're going to have all that information in the show notes. So if you didn't catch it on the fly, you can certainly grab it there. And again, a reminder, if you're listening to this episode through your favorite streaming service, we do have a video that will be over on the YouTube channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. We post those to give you the opportunity to take a look at everything we talked about and any of the graphics we referred to during the talk here. But Morag, one last time, again, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Mine too.
And folks, for now, we're going to sign off, and we thank you for listening in and being a part of this episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I hope you can take 1 or 2 nuggets out of what we've shared here today and really apply that to help improve your leadership game. The world needs us, everybody. If you are in a leadership role, we're in a bad way worldwide of needing good, effective leaders that can help make a difference right where you are. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. Have a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.